In these turbulent times when moral relativism suggests that right and wrong are merely matters of opinion, when social media amplifies every contradiction, and when traditional authorities crumble under scrutiny, you might wonder, is there any solid ground for ethical decision-making? During my years in Königsberg, wrestling with reason's capacity to guide human action, I discovered something remarkable, a principle so fundamental that it can withstand any storm of moral confusion. Consider this moment. You're faced with a choice that could benefit you significantly but would require deceiving others. The utilitarian calculates consequences. The relativist shrugs and says, "It depends." But what if there existed a method so rigorous, so universally applicable, that it could cut through this moral fog with the precision of mathematical proof? What if the very structure of rational thought itself demanded certain ethical conclusions, regardless of our desires, cultural backgrounds, or personal interests? The chaos you witness around you, political polarization, corporate corruption, personal betrayals, stems from one fundamental error, the belief that morality is optional, subjective, or dependent on external circumstances. But through careful analysis of what it means to be a rational being, I uncovered moral laws as necessary and universal as the laws of logic itself. Today, I'll show you how the categorical imperative provides an unshakable foundation for navigating even the most complex ethical terrain of your modern world. Chapter 1: The Architecture of Rational Moral Law. The foundation of genuine moral self-governance begins with understanding a crucial distinction that most people overlook entirely. When we examine human actions, we discover two fundamentally different sources of motivation: inclination and duty. This distinction, which emerged during my systematic investigation of practical reason, reveals why traditional approaches to ethics inevitably collapse under pressure. Inclination encompasses everything that feels natural: our desires, emotions, cultural conditioning, and personal preferences. These forces certainly influence behavior, but they cannot ground universal moral principles because they vary among individuals and circumstances. When someone acts honestly because honesty feels right, or because they were raised that way, their action may conform to moral requirements, but it lacks the stability needed for genuine ethical living. Duty, by contrast, represents motivation derived purely from rational recognition of moral law. When we act from duty, we recognize that certain principles must govern behavior regardless of what we want or how we feel. This recognition doesn't emerge from external authority or arbitrary command, but from understanding what rational consistency itself demands. The categorical imperative emerges from this analysis as the fundamental principle of pure practical reason. Unlike hypothetical imperatives, which command conditionally, if you want X, then do Y, the categorical imperative commands unconditionally. It tells us what we must do simply by virtue of being rational beings, independent of our particular goals or circumstances. Consider how this applies to promise-keeping. The hypothetical approach says, if you want people to trust you, keep your promises. But what if you don't care about trust? What if breaking this particular promise would benefit you more than keeping it? The categorical imperative takes a different approach entirely. It asks, can you let everyone make false promises whenever convenient? The moment you universalize this maxim, you discover its logical impossibility. A world where everyone broke promises at will would be a world where the institution of promising itself collapsed. This reveals the genius of moral law. It doesn't depend on consequences, emotions, or external rewards. Instead, it demonstrates that rational consistency itself generates absolute moral requirements. Just as mathematical truths hold regardless of whether we like them, moral truths hold regardless of whether they align with our inclinations. The chaos in your world often stems from people attempting to make exceptions for themselves while expecting others to follow rules. But reason demands universalizability. When you recognize this, You gain access to moral certainty that no external circumstances can shake. The categorical imperative becomes your moral compass precisely because it's grounded in the very structure of rational thought itself. Chapter 2: Testing your actions through universal law. The first formulation of the categorical imperative provides a practical method for evaluating the moral worth of any action. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This isn't merely an abstract principle, it's a rigorous test that reveals the rational foundation underlying all genuine moral obligations. Let me walk you through how this universalization test works in practice. Every action you contemplate can be described through a maxim, a principle that captures both the action and its motivation. The moral question becomes, can you consistently will that everyone follow this same principle in relevantly similar circumstances? Take a contemporary example that troubles many of your generation: digital privacy. Suppose you're considering lying about your data usage to avoid corporate surveillance. Your maxim might be, I will deceive corporations about my digital activities whenever I believe they're violating my privacy. Now apply the universalization test. Can you will that everyone adopt this principle? Initially, this might seem reasonable. Who wouldn't want protection from corporate overreach? But examine more carefully. If everyone systematically deceived corporations about their digital behavior, what would happen to the entire framework of digital services? Companies would either cease providing services or develop such extensive verification systems that the digital world would become a surveillance state far worse than current conditions. The universalization test reveals that your maxim leads to a contradiction. You want to use deception to preserve privacy in a system that depends on at least basic honesty to function. You're essentially willing the simultaneous existence and destruction of the conditions that make your action possible. This demonstrates why consequences matter less than logical consistency. Even if your particular lie might produce good results, the principle underlying it cannot be universalized without contradiction. Genuine moral principles must be able to govern a world where everyone follows them. Consider another pressing example: tax avoidance through legal loopholes. The maxim might be, I will minimize my tax burden through any legal means available, regardless of the system's intent. Universalize this principle. If everyone exploited every possible loophole, what happens to the tax system itself? It collapses, eliminating the very legal framework that created the loopholes you're exploiting. The universalization test doesn't require you to predict actual consequences or consider whether others will follow your example. Instead, it demands logical consistency. Can the principle underlying your actions serve as a universal law without contradicting itself? This transforms moral reasoning from guesswork about outcomes into rigorous analysis of rational consistency. Notice how this method cuts through cultural relativism and personal bias. It doesn't matter whether your society approves of tax avoidance or whether you personally benefit from it. The logical structure of the maxim itself determines its moral status. This is why the categorical imperative provides such stable guidance in a chaotic world. It grounds morality in reason rather than opinion, emotion, or circumstance. When you master this universalization test, you gain a tool more powerful than any external moral authority. You become capable of genuine moral self-governance because you can determine for yourself, through pure reason, which actions are ethically permissible and which are forbidden. Chapter 3: Treating Humanity as an End in Itself. The second formulation of the categorical imperative reveals the substantive content of moral law: act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This principle doesn't just tell us how to test moral maxims, it shows us why certain actions are wrong and others required. Understanding this formulation requires grasping what makes humanity special among all things in the world. Everything else has either a price or no value at all. Objects have market prices, We can replace them with equivalents or substitute them for something else of comparable worth. Even our inclinations and preferences have relative worth. They matter to us but not necessarily to others, and their value fluctuates with circumstances. But humanity possesses something entirely different: dignity. Dignity cannot be priced, traded, or substituted. It exists equally in every rational being regardless of their particular talents, achievements, or social status. This dignity stems from our capacity for moral reasoning, our ability to recognize and follow principles we give ourselves through reason rather than being determined entirely by natural instincts or external forces. When you treat someone merely as a means, you ignore their dignity as a rational being. You reduce them to an instrument for achieving your purposes, denying their capacity for autonomous moral decision-making. This doesn't mean you can never benefit from others' actions or ask for their help. Such interactions are part of normal social life. The problem arises when you manipulate, deceive, or coerce others in ways that bypass their rational agency. Consider how this applies to modern technology platforms. Social media companies often design their systems to exploit psychological vulnerabilities, capturing attention through mechanisms that bypass conscious deliberation. Users become means for generating advertising revenue, their rational autonomy undermined by algorithmic manipulation. Even though users consent by accepting terms of service, this consent is manufactured through psychological engineering rather than emerging from informed rational choice. Or examine contemporary labor practices. When employers demand productivity that prevents workers from maintaining their health, developing their capacities, or fulfilling their responsibilities to others, they treat workers merely as means. They extract value while denying the conditions necessary for human flourishing and autonomous moral agency. The positive dimension of this principle is equally important. Treating humanity as an end requires actively supporting others' capacity for rational self-determination. This means not just avoiding harmful interference, but creating conditions where people can develop and exercise their moral autonomy. In your personal relationships, this translates to honesty that respects others' ability to make informed decisions, patience that allows them to work through moral questions themselves, and support that strengthens rather than undermines their independence. Take a moment to examine your own life. How often do you treat others merely as means to your ends? When you flatter someone to gain their cooperation, when you withhold information to maintain an advantage, when you make decisions for others without consulting them, in all these cases, you're failing to respect their dignity as rational beings. But notice how this principle also applies to yourself. You cannot treat your own humanity merely as a means either. This prohibits self-destructive behaviors that undermine your capacity for moral reasoning, whether through substance abuse, accepting degrading treatment from others, or abandoning your responsibilities to pursue immediate gratification. The genius of this formulation is that it grounds human rights and dignity not in arbitrary declaration or cultural consensus, but in the very nature of rational agency itself. Anyone capable of moral reasoning possesses absolute worth that no circumstances can diminish. This provides an unshakable foundation for human equality and justice that no relativistic argument can undermine. Chapter 4: Goodwill and the Purity of Moral Motivation. The most fundamental insight of my entire moral philosophy centers on a simple but revolutionary claim: the only thing in the world that is good without qualification is goodwill. This principle cuts to the heart of why external success, social approval, and even beneficial consequences cannot determine moral worth. Understanding goodwill provides the key to maintaining moral integrity regardless of how chaotic or corrupt your environment becomes. Most people measure moral success by results. Did your action help someone? Did it prevent harm? Did it make you feel good about yourself? But this approach makes morality hostage to circumstances beyond your control. You might intend to help someone but accidentally cause harm. You might try to prevent suffering but find your efforts backfire. If moral worth depends on outcomes, then moral worth depends on luck, a conclusion that undermines the possibility of genuine ethical responsibility. Goodwill, by contrast, refers to the motivation to act from duty rather than inclination. When you act from goodwill, you choose your action because you recognize it as morally required, not because you expect reward, approval, or even beneficial consequences. This doesn't mean you ignore consequences entirely. Responsible action requires considering likely effects. But moral worth lies in choosing duty over inclination when these conflict. Consider a contemporary example that reveals this distinction clearly. Suppose you discover that a colleague is embezzling money from your company. You face a choice: report the theft or remain silent. Your inclinations might pull in various directions. Perhaps you like this person, fear workplace conflict, or worry about being seen as a troublemaker. Utilitarian calculation might be complex. Reporting could prevent future theft but also destroy someone's career and family stability. But goodwill asks a different question: what does duty require? If you can universalize a maxim of reporting workplace theft, and if remaining silent treats your company and its stakeholders merely as means to avoid personal discomfort, then duty demands reporting regardless of your feelings or the complexity of consequences. Acting from goodwill means choosing this course because it's right, not because it's easy or because you expect specific results. This principle becomes especially crucial when social pressure pushes toward moral compromise. During my lifetime, I witnessed how political upheaval could corrupt even well-intentioned people who allowed fear or expedience to override moral principle. Your digital age presents similar challenges: the speed of social media, the pressure for immediate responses, the amplification of outrage all create environments where acting from inclination seems easier than pausing to consider what duty actually requires. Goodwill also protects against moral pride, the dangerous tendency to judge your worth by comparing yourself favorably to others. When moral worth lies in motivation rather than achievement, you cannot take credit for circumstances that make virtue easier for you than for others. Someone who struggles with honesty due to difficult circumstances but still chooses truth over lie demonstrates greater moral worth than someone for whom honesty comes naturally. This insight transforms how you understand moral failure as well. When you act from inclination rather than duty, the failure lies in motivation, not in external results. This means moral repair requires examining and correcting your internal commitment to rational principle, not just changing your behavior or making amends for consequences. The practical implication is liberating. You can maintain perfect moral integrity regardless of external chaos because moral worth depends entirely on something within your control: your commitment to act from duty rather than inclination. No political corruption, social breakdown, or personal crisis can force you to abandon goodwill unless you choose to abandon it. This doesn't make moral life easier. Often, acting from duty requires considerable effort and sacrifice. But it makes moral life possible even in the worst circumstances, because it grounds ethical responsibility in rational choice rather than external fortune. Chapter 5: Moral Freedom and Human Dignity. The most profound discovery of my critical philosophy concerns the relationship between freedom and morality. Without understanding this connection, you cannot grasp why moral principles carry absolute authority or how rational beings transcend the deterministic natural world. This insight becomes especially crucial in your contemporary context, where scientific materialism often suggests that human choice is ultimately illusory. In the realm of natural phenomena, what I call the sensible world, everything operates according to causal laws. Every event results necessarily from prior causes in an unbroken chain stretching back indefinitely. If human beings were nothing more than sophisticated natural objects, then our actions would be as determined as the movements of planets or the behavior of chemical reactions. Moral responsibility would be impossible because genuine choice requires the ability to act differently than natural causation would determine. But the categorical imperative reveals something remarkable about human nature. When you recognize moral duty, you simultaneously recognize your capacity to act against natural inclination. The ought of moral law implies the can of moral freedom. If morality commands certain actions, and if these commands have genuine authority, then you must possess the freedom to follow them even when doing so contradicts your natural desires. This freedom doesn't violate natural causation, it transcends it. As beings who exist simultaneously in both the sensible and intelligible worlds, you are subject to natural laws as physical objects but capable of self-determination as rational agents. Your body operates according to biological imperatives, your emotions follow psychological patterns, your social behavior responds to cultural influences. But your capacity for moral reasoning allows you to step back from these determining factors and choose actions based on principles you legislate for yourself through reason. Consider how this applies to contemporary questions about criminal justice. The debate between punishment and rehabilitation often assumes that people are either fully responsible for their actions or completely determined by circumstances. But understanding moral freedom reveals a more nuanced truth. Environmental factors certainly influence behavior. Poverty, trauma, addiction, and social conditioning all create powerful pressures towards certain choices. But moral responsibility requires only that agents possess sufficient rational capacity to recognize moral demands and sufficient freedom to act on this recognition, even when doing so is difficult. This perspective transforms how you understand your own moral development as well. You cannot excuse moral failures by appealing to personality, upbringing, or emotional state, because moral freedom precisely consists in your ability to act according to rational principle despite these influences. At the same time, you cannot take full credit for moral success if external circumstances make virtue relatively easy for you. The practical implications extend far beyond individual ethics. Political freedom, properly understood, consists not in the absence of all constraint but in collective self-legislation through rational democratic processes. A free society is one where citizens participate in creating the laws that govern them, rather than being subject to arbitrary external authority. This connects individual moral autonomy to social and political autonomy. Both depend on rational beings' capacity to govern themselves through principles they can universally endorse. Your digital age presents new challenges to moral freedom through sophisticated mechanisms of behavioral manipulation. Algorithms designed to capture attention, personalized advertising that exploits psychological profiles, social media platforms that amplify emotional responses, all these technologies threaten to reduce human choice to predictable patterns of stimulus and response. Maintaining moral freedom requires constant vigilance against these attempts to bypass rational deliberation. But the same technology also creates unprecedented opportunities for moral education and connection. You have access to philosophical wisdom from across history and cultures, ability to connect with others facing similar moral challenges, and tools for careful reflection that can support rather than undermine rational autonomy. The key insight remains constant. Your dignity as a human being rests on your capacity for moral self-determination. No external circumstances can eliminate this capacity unless you surrender it voluntarily. Even in the most constrained situations, you retain the freedom to choose your response according to moral principle rather than mere inclination. This freedom is what makes you human in the deepest sense, a being capable of acting from self-imposed rational law rather than being entirely determined by natural forces. Chapter 6: Building Moral Character in Imperfect Institutions. The practical challenge of moral living emerges most clearly when we examine how to maintain ethical integrity within institutions that often reward vice and punish virtue. Your contemporary world presents this challenge with particular intensity. Corporate environments that incentivize deception, political systems that reward manipulation, educational institutions that emphasize conformity over critical thinking. Understanding how to navigate these contexts requires applying moral principles to systematic social problems. The fundamental insight is that institutional corruption cannot excuse individual moral failure, but it does create special obligations for those committed to ethical living. When you participate in systems that systematically violate moral principles, you face complex questions about complicity, resistance, and reform. The categorical imperative provides guidance, but applying it requires careful analysis of your particular situation and responsibilities. Consider the challenge of working within corporations that prioritize profit maximization over human welfare. Perhaps your company manufactures products with planned obsolescence, uses marketing that exploits psychological vulnerabilities, or maintains supply chains that depend on exploitative labor practices. You need employment to fulfill your own responsibilities, but continued participation seems to make you complicit in systematic wrongdoing. The universalization test helps clarify your obligations. Ask yourself, can I will that everyone in my position act as I'm considering acting? If you're contemplating whistleblowing, can you will that everyone expose institutional wrongdoing when they encounter it? Generally, yes. A world where people consistently reported systematic violations of human dignity would be better than one where such violations continued unchallenged. If you're contemplating quiet resignation, can you will that everyone simply leave corrupt institutions without working for reform? This is more problematic. Universal withdrawal might eliminate opportunities for positive change while leaving harmful systems intact. The humanity formulation provides additional guidance. Remaining silent about institutional wrongdoing often treats victims merely as means. You protect your own comfort while allowing others to be harmed by practices you could help expose. But reckless accusations without solid evidence might treat accused parties merely as means to your desire for moral purity. These considerations suggest a more nuanced approach. Moral integrity within imperfect institutions typically requires, first, refusing personal participation in clearly unethical practices regardless of professional consequences. Second, working to reform systems where possible through legitimate channels. Third, supporting others who speak out against institutional wrongdoing. Fourth, developing expertise and credibility that makes your eventual criticism more effective. Fifth, preparing to accept significant personal costs rather than continuing complicity in severe violations of human dignity. Educational institutions present similar challenges. Perhaps you're a student in a program that emphasizes technical skills while ignoring ethical formation, or you're an educator in a system that prioritizes standardized test scores over critical thinking development. The temptation is either to conform completely or to reject the system entirely. But moral responsibility often requires finding ways to work within imperfect structures while maintaining commitment to higher principles. This might mean supplementing your technical education with ethical reflection, finding mentors who model intellectual integrity, or creating unofficial opportunities for deeper learning. As an educator, it might mean subverting standardized curricula to include moral reasoning, supporting students who question institutional priorities, or documenting how current practices undermine genuine educational goals. Political participation raises perhaps the most complex challenges. Democratic systems require compromise and incremental change, but compromise can become a cover for abandoning principle. Supporting political candidates means endorsing not just their stated positions but their character and likely behavior in office. Voting for the lesser evil might perpetuate systems that systematically violate human dignity. The key insight is that moral purity is impossible within imperfect institutions, but moral integrity remains both possible and required. Integrity means maintaining commitment to fundamental principles while accepting that implementing these principles requires working through flawed systems. This differs from moral compromise, which abandons principles for the sake of easier outcomes. Building moral character within imperfect institutions also requires developing practical wisdom about timing, strategy, and coalition building. Moral principles tell you what ends to pursue, but achieving those ends in complex social contexts requires careful attention to means. Sometimes immediate confrontation serves moral purposes, sometimes patient preparation for future action is more effective. The ultimate goal is not personal moral purity but contributing to institutional reform that better reflects human dignity and rational autonomy. This requires balancing individual integrity with social responsibility, principled action with strategic thinking, and immediate obligations with long-term goals. Chapter 7: Applying Kantian Ethics to Modern Moral Dilemmas. Contemporary moral challenges often seem to resist traditional ethical frameworks, but the categorical imperative provides robust guidance for navigating even the most complex dilemmas of your technological age. By applying systematic moral reasoning to current issues, we can demonstrate how rational principles maintain their authority across changing circumstances while revealing new dimensions of human responsibility. Consider the ethical challenges posed by artificial intelligence and automation. As machines become capable of tasks previously requiring human judgment, questions arise about moral responsibility, economic displacement, and the nature of human dignity itself. A utilitarian might calculate the aggregate benefits and harms, but this approach struggles with questions of distributive justice and intrinsic human worth. The categorical imperative cuts through this complexity. First, apply the universalization test to policies governing AI development. Can you will that everyone develop AI systems designed to maximize efficiency regardless of impact on human agency? Such a world would systematically undermine the conditions necessary for moral autonomy. People would become increasingly dependent on machines for decisions that require rational reflection. This fails the universalization test because it wills the destruction of the moral agency that makes the willing itself possible. The humanity formulation provides additional guidance. AI systems that manipulate human behavior through psychological profiling treat users merely as means to corporate or political ends. Even AI designed to help people by making decisions for them can violate human dignity if it bypasses rather than supports rational deliberation. Ethical AI development must enhance rather than replace human moral agency. This doesn't prohibit all automation, but it establishes clear criteria. Acceptable AI systems respect human autonomy by providing information and analysis that support better decision-making rather than replacing human judgment entirely. They operate transparently so people understand how they function and can maintain meaningful control over their use. Bioethics presents another domain where Kantian principles prove especially valuable. Consider gene editing technologies that could eliminate hereditary diseases but also enable enhancement of human capabilities. Utilitarian analysis might support any intervention that reduces suffering or increases capability, but this ignores crucial questions about human nature and dignity. The universalization test reveals problems with enhancement-focused gene editing. Can you will that everyone modify their children's genetic makeup to maximize competitive advantage? This creates a world where genetic modification becomes an arms race, ultimately undermining the very advantages it seeks to create while transforming human reproduction into a technological project rather than an expression of natural human relationships. The humanity formulation is even more revealing. When parents edit their children's genes to match their own expectations or social pressures, they treat their children merely as means to their vision of success rather than respecting them as ends in themselves. This violates the child's dignity as a rational being by imposing decisions that should belong to the child's own autonomous choice. Again, this doesn't prohibit all genetic intervention. Eliminating serious genetic diseases respects human dignity by removing obstacles to flourishing rational agency. But enhancement modifications that attempt to predetermine a child's capabilities or characteristics violate the principle of treating humanity as an end in itself. Environmental ethics provides another crucial test case. Climate change presents collective action problems that seem to exceed individual moral responsibility. Your personal carbon footprint makes virtually no difference to global outcomes. But this reasoning misunderstands the nature of moral duty. The universalization test clarifies individual obligations. Can you will that everyone consume resources and generate pollution according to their immediate desires rather than considering environmental sustainability? Obviously not. Such behavior is literally unsustainable. This means you have a duty to limit your environmental impact regardless of whether others do the same. The humanity formulation extends this analysis. Climate change disproportionately affects the world's poorest populations, who have contributed least to the problem. Continuing high-consumption lifestyles while knowing they contribute to suffering treats vulnerable populations merely as means to your comfort and convenience. Social media and digital privacy raise additional challenges. The business model of major platforms depends on collecting personal data to sell targeted advertising. Users receive free services in exchange for information about their behavior, preferences, and relationships. Is this a fair trade or a form of exploitation? The universalization test suggests problems. Can you will that everyone's personal information be collected, analyzed, and sold without meaningful informed consent? This creates a world where privacy becomes impossible, undermining the conditions necessary for autonomous reflection and intimate relationships. The humanity formulation reveals deeper issues. Current data collection practices treat users merely as sources of valuable information rather than as rational beings capable of making informed decisions about their own privacy. Platform design often manipulates user behavior through psychological techniques that bypass conscious decision-making. These applications demonstrate how Kantian ethics provides both critique of current practices and guidance for reform. The solutions often require institutional changes rather than just individual choices, but individual commitment to moral principles remains the foundation for social progress. Conclusion. The chaos surrounding you, moral confusion, institutional corruption, technological disruption, cannot touch the one thing that makes you truly human, your capacity for rational self-determination through moral principle. In a world where everything seems relative and uncertain, the categorical imperative provides absolute guidance grounded not in arbitrary authority but in the very structure of rational thought itself. You now possess tools that can withstand any storm of ethical uncertainty. When facing difficult decisions, ask whether you can universalize your proposed action without contradiction, and whether you're treating all affected parties as ends rather than merely as means. These tests will guide you through complexities that reduce others to confused paralysis or cynical abandonment of moral standards. Remember that moral worth lies not in achieving perfect outcomes, these remain beyond your control, but in maintaining goodwill and commitment to duty regardless of circumstances. The dignity that makes you human cannot be taken from you by external forces, it can only be surrendered through your own choice to abandon rational moral principle. In applying these insights to contemporary challenges, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, climate change, digital privacy, you participate in the ongoing development of practical reason that began in my study in Königsberg and continues wherever rational beings seek to live according to self-imposed universal law. Your moral freedom is both your greatest possession and your greatest responsibility. Use it wisely, guided by reason's demands for consistency and respect for humanity's inherent dignity. In doing so, you contribute to the slow but inevitable progress of moral enlightenment that represents humanity's highest calling and greatest hope.